Hello, class. I am Shaina Mae E, your discussant for today's discussion. Our topic for today is all about The Teacher by Scrivener. But before we begin to our proper discussion, let's tackle first about the author. Scrivener became an English teacher temporarily while deciding on a career. His first job was with voluntary service overseas in Kenya. Worked as a lecturer with the British Council in the USSR, served as a director of education at International House Hungary, led a team that designed the Euro language exams, authored teaching grammar, Oxford, and resources for the Straightforward series, writes a monthly teaching tips column for Guardian Weekly and on OneStopEnglish.com, holds an MA in creative writing but hasn't decided how to use it. Now, let's begin to our proper discussions. What is a teacher? Language learners don't always need teachers. They can set about learning in a variety of ways. Some learn by studying on their own at home with books, CDs, cassettes, multimedia computer programs, videotapes, and so on. Others seems to pick up a language just by living and communicating in a place where the language is used. This is known as immersion. Of course, many students do learn in classes with other students and a teacher whether that's a class they choose to come to. For example, at a language school or maybe a class they were required to attend, such as in high school. And much language learning will involve elements of all three ways: self study, picking it up, and classroom work. But if it's possible to learn successfully without a teacher, then what difference does having a teacher make to the learning process? Why do some people pay to have a teacher? What do students expect from them? To put it bluntly, what on earth are teachers for? If you are or are planning to be a teacher, it's important to consider such basic question. Entertainer teaching. Learners come to class to learn a language rather than to be amused by a great show. Certainly, no one would wish their lessons to be boring. But it's important to check out if the classes of an entertainer style of teacher are genuinely leading to any real learning. It's easy to get swept up in the sheer panache of one's own performance. The teacher who constantly talks a lot, telling stories and jokes, amusing the class with their antics, etc., can provide a delivering hour, but it may simply cover up the fact that very little has been taken in and used by the students. The monologue may provide useful exposure to one way of using language, but this isn't sufficient to justify regular lessons of this kind. I've found that quite a number of teachers suspect that this performer style is a goal they should aim for. I hope I can persuade you otherwise. Example: imagine a teacher who spends most of the class telling funny stories. Everyone laughs and has a good time, but by the end of the lesson, no one remembers the grammar rules they were supposed to learn. Traditional teaching. Traditional teaching comes in many varieties, but it is often characterized by an emphasis on chalk and talk. In other words, the teacher spends quite a lot of class time using the board and explaining things, as if transmitting knowledge to the class, with occasional questions to or from the learners. After these explanations, the students will often do some practice exercise to test whether they have understood what they have been told. Throughout the lesson, the teacher keeps control of the subject matter, makes decisions about what work is needed, and orchestrates what the students do. In this classroom, the teacher probably does most of the talking and is by far the most active person. The student's role is primarily to listen and concentrate and perhaps take notes with a view to taking in the information. Often, the teacher takes as if by right, usually but not always, benignly, permission to direct, give orders, tell off, rebuke, criticize, etc., possibly with limited or no consultation. Example: picture a teacher who explains grammar rules from the textbook, gives practice exercise, and asks students to memorize vocabulary lists. It's straightforward and organized but might feel a dull or rigid for some students. Teaching does not equal learning. Teaching does not necessarily lead to learning. The fact that the first is happening doesn't automatically mean the other must occur. Learning of anything, anywhere, demands energy and attention from the learner. One person cannot learn anything for anyone else. It has to be done by your own personal effort. Nobody else can transmit understanding or skills into your head. It is quite possible for a teacher to be putting great effort into his or her teaching and for no learning to be taking place. Similarly, a teacher could apparently be doing nothing but the students be learning a great deal. This cycle, known as an experiential learning cycle, suggests a number of conclusions for language teaching in the classroom. For example, if this cycle does represent how people learn, then the jog and mug explanation based approach may be largely inappropriate if it dominates classroom time. Giving people opportunities to do things themselves may be much more important. I may become a better teacher if I worry less about teaching techniques and try to make the enabling of learning my own concern. Example: the inner circle of the diagram rather than the outer one. I need to ensure that I allow my students practical experience in doing things, example, in using language rather than simply listening to lectures about language. It may be that being over helpful as a teacher could get in the way of learning. I cannot learn for my students. The more I do myself, the less space there will be for the learners to do things. It may be useful to help students become more aware about how they are learning, to reflect on this and to explore what procedures, materials, techniques, or approaches would help them learn more effectively. It's okay for students to make mistakes, to try things out and get things wrong and learn from that. And that's true for me as a learning teacher as well. The importance of rapport. Interestingly, when he recalled his own teachers at school, he found it quite hard to recall details of any specific individual lessons. But he can recall quite strongly the way that the teacher related to the class and how he felt in this teacher's presence. He thinks of some whose lessons were bright and enjoyable, some whose lessons were frightening and tense, some who seemed to bring out the best in him, and some who closed him up. The way the teacher related to the learners, and consequently how learners related to each other, was significantly different in different classrooms. Respect, empathy, and authenticity. Carl Rogers, an American psychologist, suggests that there are three core teacher characteristics that help to create an effective learning environment. These are respect, a positive and non judgmental regard for another person; empathy, being able to see things from the other person's perspectives as if looking through their eyes; and authenticity, being oneself without hiding behind job titles, roles, or masks. When a teacher has these three qualities, the relationships within the classroom are likely to be stronger and deeper, and communication between people much more open and honest. The educational climate becomes positive, forward looking, and supportive. The learners are able to work with less fear of taking risks or facing challenges. In doing this, they increase their own self esteem and self understanding, gradually taking more and more of the responsibility for their own learning themselves rather than assuming that it is someone else's job. Rogers and Frelberg 1994 considered that out of these three teacher characteristics, authenticity was the most important. To be yourself, not to play the role of a teacher, but to take the risk of being vulnerable and human honest. Gay Huston, 1990, has written that the foundation of rapport is to learn yourself enough that you know what style you have and when you are being truthful to yourself. Although there are some practical techniques you can learn to improve your communication with others, real rapport is something more substantial than a technique that you can mimic. It is not something you do to other people. It is you and your moment by moment relationship with other human beings. Similarly, respect or empathy or authenticity are not clothes to put on as you walk into the classroom, not temporary characteristics that you take on for the duration of your lesson. You cannot role play respect or any of the other qualities. On the contrary, they are rooted at the level of your genuine intentions. In order to improve the quality of our own relationship in the classroom, we do not need to learn new techniques. We need to look closely at what we really want for our students, how we really feel about them. It is our attitude and intentions rather than our methodology that we may need to work on. There are three kinds of teachers according to Adrian Underhills. Number one, the explainer. Number two, the involver. And lastly, the enabler. The explainer. Many teachers know their subject matter very well, but have limited knowledge or teaching methodology. This kind of teacher relies mainly on explaining or lecturing as a way of conveying information to the students, than with style or enthusiasm or wit or imagination. This teacher's lesson can be very entertaining, interesting, and informative. The students are listening, perhaps occasionally answering questions, and perhaps making notes, but are mostly not being personally involved or challenged. The learners often get practice by doing individual exercises after one phase of the lecture has finished. Example, a math teacher explaining step by step how to solve an equation. The second one is the involver. This teacher also knows the subject matter that is being dealt with. In our case, this is essentially the English language and how it works. However, she is also familiar with teaching methodology. She is able to use appropriate teaching and organizational procedures and techniques to help her students learn about the subject matter. Teacher explanations may be one of these techniques, but in her case, it is only one option among many that she has at her disposal. The teacher is trying to involve the students actively and puts a great deal of effort into finding appropriate and interesting activities that will do this, while still retaining clear control over the classroom and what happens in it. Example, a language teacher using role-play games to practice conversation skills. And lastly, the enabler. The third kind of teacher is confident enough to share control with the learners, or perhaps to hand it over to them entirely. Decisions made in her classroom may often be shared or negotiated. In many cases, she takes her lead from the students, seeing herself as someone whose job is to create the conditions that enable students to learn for themselves. Sometimes this will involve her in less traditional teaching. She may become a guide or a counselor or a resource of information when needed. Sometimes, when the class is working well under its own system, when a lot of autonomous learning is going on, she may be hardly visible. This teacher knows about the subject matter and about methodology, but also has an awareness of how individual and groups are thinking and feeling within her class. She actively responds to this in her planning and methods and in building effective working relationships and a good classroom atmosphere. Her own personality and attitude are an active encouragement to this learning. Example, a science teacher encouraging students to design their experiments and draw their conclusions. Summary of focus areas. Explainer focuses on subject matter, a strong knowledge of the content but limited teaching methods or people skills. The second one is involver, combines subject matter and methodology, uses effective teaching techniques to actively engage students. And lastly, enabler, integrates subject matter, methodology, and people, encourages independent learning, and builds positive relationships with students. These three descriptions of teachers are, of course, very broadly painted. There is no way to categorize all teaching under three headings. Many teachers will find elements of each category that are true for them, or that they move between categories depending on the day, the class, and the aims of a lesson. However, this simple categorization may help you to reflect on what kind of teaching you have mostly experienced in your life so far, and may also help you to clarify what kind of teacher you see yourself as being now or in the future. Now let's proceed to the teacher interventions. What is a classroom management? Your most important job is perhaps to create the conditions in which learning can take place. The skills of creating and managing a successful class may be the key to the whole success of a course. An important part of this is to do with your attitude, intentions, and personality, and your relationships with the learners. However, you also need certain organizational skills and techniques. Such items are often grouped together under the heading of classroom management. Common classroom management areas include grouping and setting, forming groupings, singles, pairs, groups, mingle, and plenary, arranging and rearranging setting, deciding where you will stand or sit, reforming class as a whole group activities. Second one is activities, sequencing activities, setting up, giving instructions, monitoring activities, timing activities, and such. Third one is authority, gathering and holding attention, deciding who does that, example, answer a question and make decisions and such. Fourth one is critical moments, starting the lesson, dealing with unexpected problems. The fifth one is tools and techniques, using the board and other classroom equipment or aids, using gestures to help clarity of instruction and explanations, speaking clearly at an appropriate volume and speed, use of silence, and such. And lastly, we have working with people, spreading your attention evenly and appropriately, using intuition to gauge what students are feeling, eliciting honest feedback from students, and really listening to students. Classroom management involves both decisions and actions. The actions are what is done in the classroom, example, rearranging the chairs. The decisions are about whether to do these actions, when to do them, how to do them, and who will do them. Classroom interaction. The language classroom is rich in language for learners. Quite apart from the language that learners and teacher may suppose they are focusing on the subject matter of the lesson. Students learn a lot of their language from what they hear you say, the instructions, the discussions, the sides, the jokes, the chit chat, the comments, etc. Having said that, it would be unsatisfactory if your talk dominated the lesson to the exclusion of participation from as many learners as possible. Maximizing student interaction in class. Some ideas: encourage a friendly, relaxed learning environment. If there is a trusting, positive support report amongst the learners and between learners and you, then there is a much better chance of useful interaction happening. Ask questions rather than giving explanations. Allow time for students to listen, think, process their answers, and speak. Really listen to what they say. Let what they say really affect what you do next. Work on listening to the person and the meaning, as well as to the language and mistakes. Allow thinking time without talking over it. Allow silence. Increase opportunities for STT or student talking time. Use gestures to replace unnecessary teacher talk. Allow students to finish their own sentences. Make use of pairs and small groups to maximize opportunities for students to speak. Do this even in the middle of longer whole class stages. Example, ask questions to break off for 30 seconds and talk in pairs about their reactions to what you've just been discussing. If possible, arrange seating so that students can all see each other and talk to each other. Example, circles, squares, and horseshoes rather than parallel laws. Remember that you don't always need to be at the front of the class. Try your seating arrangement that allows the whole class to be the focus. If a student is speaking too quietly for you to hear, walk further away rather than closer to him. This sounds illogical, but if you can't hear them, then it's likely that the other students can't either. Encourage the quiet speaker to speak louder so that the others can hear. Keep a diagram like the figure 5.2 in your head as possible alternative seating. For each activity you do in class, consider what grouping, seating, standing arrangements are most appropriate. Changing seating arrangements can help students interact with different people, change the focus from you when appropriate, and allow a range of different situations to be recreated within the classroom, as well as simply adding variety to the predictability of sitting in the same place every time. It's difficult to sit still for a long time. It's worth including activities that involve some movement, even if only to give people the chance to stretch their legs. Students might not like if there's a constant movement every 5 minutes, but some variety of working arrangement is often helpful. In some cultures, students may have clear expectations as to what is acceptable. For example, asking students to sit on their desks may be a taboo. A teacher who sits on the corner of his desk may be considered unprofessional. Respect cultural constraints, but don't let them put you off experimenting a little. Be clear about what is genuinely acceptable and what is merely unknown or unexpected. Remain aware of the possibilities of using the space you are in. Sometimes, a complete change in the room can make all the difference. Even with the most immovable of fixed sitting, it is often possible to be creative in some way. Some ideas for investigating and exploring the possibilities of movable seating. Ask students to move seats when you create pairs or small groups. Don't let students get stuck in unsuitable seating arrangements when a move is preferable. If it's really too noisy, make the discussions of that and the finding of a solution part of the lesson as well. If the students normally sit in rows, try forming a circle. Turn the classroom around so that the focus is on a different wall from normal. Make seating arrangements that reflect specific contexts, example, a train carriage, an aeroplane, a town center, or whatever. Push all seats up against the wall and make a large open forum space in the middle of the room. Deliberately place your seat off center, example, not at the front. This is an interesting subversion of expectations and immediately challenges expectations about who a teacher is and what a teacher should do. Divide the class into separate groups of far corners of the room. Ask how can we reorganize this classroom to make it a nicer place to be. Let this class discuss it and agree, then do it. Push the seats or desk up against the wall. Sit on the floor only if it's a clean classroom. Sitting possibilities in a standard classroom. Pairs, enemy corners, opposing teams, face-to-face or back-to-back, panel, public meeting, bus groups, people change groups occasionally, and lastly, wheels. The outer wheel can move round, changing pairings. Giving instructions. This may sound like a joke, but in fact, it's quite typical of an unplanned instruction. Teachers are often unaware that they are talking in this way until they stop and try to listen to what they are saying. A video or audio recording of them in action can be very helpful here. It is clear that this type of instruction is very hard for students to follow. The essential information about what to do is embedded in confusing and unnecessary babble. An essentially simple activity can become impossible, not because the students couldn't do it, but because they didn't understand what to do. Often students are judged to have failed when it's actually the teacher who failed to clarify what was required. How can I give clearer instructions? Number one, become aware of your own instruction giving. Listen to yourself, record yourself, ask others to watch you, and give feedback. Second one, for a while, pre-plan essential instructions. Analyze the instructional beforehand so as to include only the essential information in simple, clear language and sequence it in a sensible order. Use short sentences, one sentence for each key piece of information. Don't say things that are visible or obvious. I'm giving you a piece of paper. Don't give instructions that they don't need to know at this point. Example, what they'll do after this activity is finished. In class, separate instructions clearly from the other chit-chat, telling off, joking, etc. that goes on. Create a silence beforehand. Make eye contact with as many students as possible. Find an authoritative tone. Make sure they are listening before you start. Use silence and gestures to pace the instructions and clarify their meaning. Demonstrate rather than explain whatever possible. Check that students have understood what to do. Don't assume that everyone will automatically understand what you have said. Get concrete evidence from the students that they know what is required. Getting one or two students to tell you what they are going to do is one very simple way of achieving this. How to get the learner's attention. One important reason why learners may not successfully follow activity instructions or understand your explanations of something is that they didn't actually hear them, perhaps because they weren't fully paying attention when they were given. Whereas teachers often invest energy into finding better ways to word their instructions, they may overlook the need to win attention before the instruction is given. It's a vital step. An instruction given over student chatter or when students are looking the other way stands little chance of working. If this has been a problem for you, here's one strategy for getting learners' attention that you might wish to experiment with. Getting attention before giving an instruction, giving an explanation, etc. Start making eye contact with as many people as possible. Establish a gesture that means you want to speak. Example, cup hand to your ear or holding your hand up. Just wait. Don't look impatient or anxious. Keep moving your eyes around the room from person to person patiently. Think of this as a gathering attention. Enjoy it. Wait as long as necessary until there is silence and people are looking your way. If this doesn't work, don't alter it dramatically. Just add in a clear attention drawing words such as okay. Say it once and then go back to the waiting. In general, you need to establish your authority and use it appropriately. Project your voice clearly, but speak rather than shout. Control the quantity and complexity of what you say. Say what you need to as simply and clearly as possible. Participate, monitor, or vanish. What is your role once you have set up an activity in which students will mainly work on their own in pairs or groups? Sit down and read a book? Go out of the room and have a coffee? Well, I think all of these answers are possible. Deciding on your role while students do an activity. Let's distinguish two steps. Step 1. The first 30 seconds, are they doing the task set? Immediately after you have given the instructions for the task and students start doing it, there is often an immediate need to check to make sure that students are doing the activity that you asked them to do and have understood the basic instructions and the mechanics of the activity. You could do this by quietly and relatively inconspicuously wandering around the room, listening in briefly to snatches from many groups and assuring yourself that students are doing what they are supposed to. We could call this monitoring to check the mechanics. If you are around and very visible, they might look to you for language items and help whenever they hit a problem, whereas it might be more useful for them to struggle a little and learn to make use of their own resources. So once an activity is safely underway, your options often boil down to the following choices: monitor discreetly or vanish. Monitor discreetly. Discreet monitoring is when you maintain a presence in the room but do not overtly overhelp, interfere, correct, etc. Your aim is that the students know you are there, but your watching and listening does not in any way disturb them. Vanish. There are cases when any teacher presence can actually interfere with and diminish the usefulness of work being done. Sometimes the best option for you is to vanish. Example, get out of immediate eye shot. You could go into a corner of the room and sit quietly. Monitor actively. You can monitor as described above, but be more visible and allow students to be more aware of your presence and of the possibility of calling on you for help and advice. A teacher who is actively monitoring will be walking around, viewing and listening to many different groups and frequently offering spontaneous advice and corrections. And lastly, participate. You may sit down and join a group temporarily or for the whole task and take part as if you were one of the group, offering ideas, helping with questions, joining in discussions. You could quietly move on to another group. By the end of the task, you might have worked with a number of groups. Gesture. Try to develop a range of gestures and facial expressions to save yourself repeating basic instructions and increase opportunities for learners' talk. For example, I have seen many teachers using a set of gestures to indicate time. This helps them quickly correct learners who use tenses inaccurately. Pointing to the ground indicates the present, pointing ahead is the future, pointing behind over the shoulder indicates the past. Bear in mind that gestures can mean different things in different countries. If you are teaching away from your own culture, learn which gestures to avoid and always keep alert to the possibility that you might be giving offense. Here are some possible ideas. Number 1. Work in pairs. Forming a triangle with index fingers to symbolize connection or partnership. Second one, what do you think? Pointing to the head indicating a thought or question. Third one, stand up. Open palm facing upward with a slight upward motion, signaling someone to rise. Fourth one, give a longer answer. Moving hands apart suggesting expansion or elaboration. Fifth one, 5 minutes left. Showing an open palm with 5 fingers indicating the number 5. And lastly, don't show your information sheet to your partner. Placing a hand over the chest, signaling confidentiality or keeping information to oneself. Using the board well. One resource that almost every teacher has is a board. Whether it is a small board on a castle, a wide chalkboard, a pen board, or even an interactive computer board. Although it is possible to write randomly on the board as things occur in class, you'll often find that it's worth paying a little attention to organizing items. At the start of the lesson, draw a 5 dividing lines to the board. Example, to form 2 columns and 3 larger working areas like this. It seems natural enough to write standing in front of the board. Unfortunately, this blocks the view of what you're writing for the class and they can't read it till you've finished. Figure 5.6a. You also can talk to them easily. When you get a chance in an empty classroom, practice writing on the board in a way that your body doesn't block the view for everyone and you can make eye contact with the class. Figure 5.6b. This requires a slightly sideways position, which will feel odd at first, but it allows you to talk to students, ask questions, and look around, all of which can be very helpful in maintaining a good working atmosphere. Remember that it's not only teachers who can write on boards. Where appropriate, get learners to write up answers and ideas, draw pictures and timelines, etc. Board drawing. Don't say you can't draw. No matter how unmonette like your artistry, one picture is often worth many unnecessary words. for the quick explanation of vocabulary items, for setting up a discussion, a dialogue, or roleplay. For story building, you need pictures. Clearly, the basic skill is to draw people in some form, and stick people are in many ways better than detailed figures because they're so quick to do. Add character by giving different shapes of head, fantening up the bodies a little, drawing in simple clothes, adding expressions in the mouth and eyes. Add locations by a few simple props, for example, a railway line and a platform makes a station, a table knife and fork and a vase of flowers makes a restaurant. Eliciting. Eliciting means drawing out an information, language, ideas, etc. from the students. It is a technique based on the principle that students probably know a lot more than we may give them credit for. Starting with the what they know is a productive way to begin new work. Involving people in a question and answer movement towards new discoveries is often more effective than simply giving lectures. There are three steps to eliciting. I convey a clear idea to the students, perhaps by using pictures, gestures or questions, etc. They then supply the appropriate language, information, ideas, and lastly, I give them feedback. Students using their own language. They always talk in their own language. I can't get them to use English. What might the reasons be? Because it's easier to speak my own language. Because the teacher always corrects me if I speak English. Because I don't want to get it wrong in front of others. Because it's not in to speak in English. Because the teacher is only pretending not to understand my own language. I need to use my own language because I can't say what I want in English. Because the teacher can't hear me, so why should I bother? Because it's silly to speak English, it's much easier to communicate in the language we all understand. Using English in class. Use lots of listening materials to surround them in the sound of English. Put English language on the walls. Have short, clearly demarcated sections of the lesson when English is the first language. Respond positively to every effort at using English. Don't tell learners off for not using English but keep operating in English yourself. Only hear English and lastly, spend a lot of time in fluency with work without correction. Intuition. Use of intuition is fundamental to teaching. It is the skill of spontaneously understanding something, bypassing the supposed conventional route of thinking carefully and reaching a considered decision. Although it sounds somewhat magical, it is a quite down to earth, if rather unexplored, part of our teaching work. It is something that all teachers exercise to a greater or lesser degree, and it is learnable and improvable. Intuitive processes are important in teaching because things happen so fast in lesson time, and there is so much to notice. Flying at us all at once, how the activity is proceeding, how each student is reacting, etc. On the spot in class, you don't have much thinking space. Fluent teaching depends on being able to quickly read the classroom situations moment by moment and respond, or choose not to respond appropriately.